Musician David Burke has been arrested for the murder of teenager Celeste Hernandez. But will the prosecution be able to make their case? That's what we're going to talk about today on the Kolsrud, King, and Reed Report. No contest. We are here today to dig into this case. Josh, how are you today?
Oh, I'm glad it's Friday. It's been a long week as an attorney. I have to drive all over the place, get in arguments with great litigators, and then have to come back here and hold my own against Nancy Grace and other news anchors. And it's been a long week.
But isn't the whole thing about attorneys is you love to argue?
We do, but I'm also married. And I'll tell you, by the time I get home, I get beat every single time by my wife. That's for sure.
I love it. I love it. Well, let's dig right in because we have a lot to discuss with this David case. And we have talked about this case months ago. And we just now had this kind of surprise arrest of David Burke. I know that you have talked about this case on Nancy Grace. We talked about it on Court TV. You've talked about it on local news. What do you make of the timing of this arrest? Is there new evidence that came up? Did something happen that we're not aware of? What do you think's going on?
Well, the LAPD has done a few things that are really abnormal, especially for the LAPD. Number one, and commendably, they haven't leaked anything. Ordinarily in the LAPD, they have leaks everywhere. And 7 months ago, when we were trying to all be a backseat detective, trying to figure out what's going on, where's the probable cause, when is this guy going to get arrested? In particular, the most important pieces of evidence are cause of death and how long was Celeste's body inside of the Tesla. We think it was 11 days because the Tesla was ticketed and then was towed 11 days later. And then the tow people opened up the trunk and then found a dismembered body that was so decomposed that they couldn't even tell if it was male or female. And then we wanted to know what the cause of death was, because that's huge. How did this person die? Was it an overdose? Was it murder? We just don't know. And the medical records from the coroner's office are still sealed. So, I think obviously a lot of that's going to come out in the next few weeks. But as of today, there is no new evidence that has been disclosed to the public that we already didn't know about 7 months ago. Now, to answer your second question, for the procedural way that this took place, it's rather odd, Claudia, that the LAPD decides to arrest David Burke on what's called a probable cause warrant. Because what that means is that they really weren't in lockstep with the district attorney's office, the prosecutors. When you have a high-profile case where there has been an extensive investigation that's lasted more than 7 months, you would expect that the prosecutor's office, which evaluates the evidence, would want to determine how and when the case starts. You don't want your police officers doing that. And that could be an indication that there's a disconnect between the LAPD and the LA District Attorney's Office. And so let me get a little bit more into that. So what does this mean? It means that David Burke is held non-bondable, at least until Monday, where the District Attorney's Office is going to have to decide whether or not they're going to officially charge David Burke with some type of felony or crime. Now, they could do this in one of two ways. And if you're a prosecutor, you want to go to the grand jury because then it's a secret proceeding. You don't allow the defense attorneys to question your witnesses, and you don't have to really show your hand about what your theory of the case is going to be. The second way, which may happen because of how this went down yesterday, is through what's called a preliminary hearing, where a judge gets to determine whether or not probable cause exists for the charges. And the prosecution then has to put on a case. And the defense attorney gets to cross-examine each and every witness, and they can put on their own case. And they can paint the prosecution's witnesses into a corner. So later, when this goes to trial, they will be locked into testimony that they may not want to be locked into. So this puts the DA's office into a bind. And I find that very peculiar, especially in a high-profile case like this one.
Yeah, you mentioned the testimony and locking that in, and that's something that I talked about recently in reference to another case. It's like you want to have people making the least amount of statements possible, because the more statements that you have, there's that opportunity to go back and pick it apart or say, oh, well, today you said this, but 1 year ago you said that, different wording, different verbiage, and it might be nothing, but in front of a jury that can signify big problems and cause potential distrust for the witnesses. I want to jump in, though, to the cause of death, as you mentioned. So we know, theoretically, one cannot dismember themselves and put themselves in a bag. So we know that at least after death, there was involvement in movement of her body. But if we can't prove the cause of death, how difficult is that going to be for the prosecution to really put this on David and say that he had involvement?
So in California, the disfigurement of a corpse is a felony. We know at the very least, there is a felony here. Now, we can look at other cases to kind of see how this might play out. And there was another famous case called Casey Anthony, where her little girl was killed, probably murdered by Casey Anthony. But the prosecution was unable to establish the cause of death. And that was likely the largest and biggest reason why the jury acquitted her. Now, David Burke's attorneys, in their statement yesterday, kind of already foreshadowed this. They say in their statement that the cause of death can't be determined here. And they already want people to start thinking about that, because they know that it's a successful strategy in defending these types of cases. So how does a prosecutor go about proving a murder if you don't even know how the person died? Well, you can do it through circumstantial evidence, right? Like, you don't have direct evidence, meaning that you don't have a video of David Burke cutting off her head, for example. But we do know that a number of David Burke's allies and friends have been called into the grand jury to testify, and that these so-called friends have really distanced themselves from David Burke. In fact, if you go on to their Instagram profiles, most of them have completely either wiped their entire Instagram profiles clean, or they have deleted every single picture that they've ever had with David Burke. And so if David Burke ever told any one of his supposed friends or allies that he murdered Celeste, or said something similar in a text message conversation, I know they were looking into Discord as well, that would be a very strong piece of evidence that could very well convince a jury that despite not knowing the exact cause of death, that she was murdered, and she was murdered by David Burke.
Let's talk about these friends, so-called friends. I mean, I wouldn't be mad if my friends did rat me out for murder. Like, I got to be honest, like, that's okay. I don't plan on murdering anyone. So Want to put that out there. But if you had evidence, I would be okay with you sharing that. But let's talk about those people. So let's say, and this is all speculation, pure speculation, what I'm about to say. We do know that they have been called in front of the grand jury, but what if one or more of them went in there and said, oh, yeah, I was there when this happened, or I was there during the cleanup? Some part of it, maybe they were given immunity. Do you think that that will strengthen the prosecution's case, or will it still not really look that great because, well, why didn't you come forward? Why did you let him just throw her in the trunk and carry on with life as though it was normal?
So there is information that it's likely that at least one of David Burke's friends was granted immunity to testify before the grand jury because you have a constitutional right not to self-incriminate yourself. It's the Fifth Amendment. You heard the Miranda rights. That's what I'm talking about. And he refused to show up for the grand jury. But he eventually did testify at the grand jury, according to reports. And that tells me that he was likely given some sort of immunity over his statements. And if I'm a defense attorney defending David Burke, I'm going to be sweating a little bit about what that testimony was. Now, in your hypothetical, if these friends were there and saw David Burke certainly assaulting or murdering Celeste, he's toast. But if he's cleaning up blood or dismembering her body, that is certainly strong evidence. But again, that certainly proves to disfigurement of a corpse, but it may not prove that he was the one that murdered her. So this is going to be a challenge, unless they have an admission type of statement from David Burke himself, or there's an eyewitness that can place him at the scene of the crime. What you want is motive, opportunity, and the ability to do this, right? That's what most crimes have. So the prosecutors are looking for motive. Why would David want to murder supposedly his paramour, his girlfriend, his love? They shared the same tattoos. He supposedly wrote songs about her, including songs maybe that some believe foreshadowed the murder. What is his motive here? And then opportunity. His attorneys are going to claim that during that 11-day period, when the Tesla was first ticketed and then towed, that he was on tour. So he certainly may have an alibi defense. Now, nobody knows how long she was in the trunk, period. That body was so decomposed that she could have been in there for months. Nobody knows. And nobody knows who actually drove the Tesla and illegally parked it down the road. And if you're trying to get away with murder, it seems like that's one of the dumbest things that you could ever do, because eventually, the car is going to be towed and everything inside it's going to be searched. So there's so many questions that I can't wait to find out the answers for in this case.
Let's talk a little bit about the victim and this relationship that you just mentioned. So she was a teenager, and I think 12 or 13 maybe when they first met or came into contact. So we've got some issues here just with the relationship, and we've got some potential domestic issues. We've got a power dynamic. We've got an underage young lady. We've got her getting a tattoo the same as him. Did she want to do that? Was she forced to do that? We don't know. We know that she was reported missing, I think, on multiple occasions by her family, but it's almost as though she was hiding in plain sight for a while anyway. What do you make of the relationship And how do you think, if we get to trial, how will just that affect the jury in looking at this defendant?
Well, there's so much to unpack here. I've read reports, and again, this you don't know the credibility of what you're reading, but that her parents knew of the relationship and that their parents were taken care of financially by David to allow this to occur. The family, who are not native English speakers, haven't really made very many comments about this case. Now, if they were English speakers, I would certainly expect that they would be at the forefront of the media, demanding answers and demanding accountability. But I do know, my wife is from Mexico, and I know that if something weird happened in the United States, she may feel intimidated by law enforcement and the media, and may not act the same way that somebody born here would act. But if the parents were aware of this relationship and permitted it to occur, there's going to have to be some reckoning with that. And again, these are just rumors. We don't know anything yet. Now, this also kind of goes into the idea, whether or not there can be charges against David Burke for some type of child molestation or sexual assault or child exploitation against the victim. Now, when there's a deceased victim, unless semen is found in the body, for example, it's very difficult to charge the case because you don't have the witness that you do need in order to convict them. So unless there's a video or pictures of the child molestation or sexual assault or child exploitation occurring, I don't think that they're going to be able to do much with it. But again, we don't know what the coroner has found. I'm sure that they did what's called a serology test, looking for the different types of liquid DNA, which includes saliva, and it includes blood, and it includes semen, vaginal fluids, and to see whether or not there was any type of sexual assault that occurred. And if there is, that may actually tie into motive as well. And, again, we don't know if David had any accomplices. And again, this is all alleged. We're not saying he did this because nobody knows at this stage. So we're talking in hypotheticals to you lawyers out there. This is not defamation. But it is very suspicious. And, frankly, I have been waiting for this arrest for a really long time because during the first search warrant, they seized all the computer equipment. They seized his phones. So they had tons of data to sift through. And maybe that's why it took 7 months, because it's literally terabytes of data that they kind of have to put together like a huge puzzle and figure out what was going on. And another odd thing is, I read that his defense attorneys were at the house when he was arrested. So, it sounded like they knew this was going to happen, which is another odd thing to happen. Did they know and not the DA's office? Because through the statements, it kind of seems that way.
That is very odd. Let's talk about his attorneys. I want to read a part of the statement that was made after his arrest. Let us be clear. The actual evidence in this case will show that David Burke did not murder Celeste Rivas Hernandez, and he was not the cause of her death. There has been no indictment returned by any grand jury in this case and no criminal complaint filed. David has only been detained under suspicion. We will vigorously defend David's innocence. Does this speak to you as defense bravado and just coming out and saying they got nothing? Or does the fact that they specifically say he was not the cause of her death, and kind of you alluded to that earlier, are we playing towards something that happened after her death? Or are we going to try to say he didn't do anything, he was not involved, he barely knew this girl?
I actually think what they did was very brilliant. They didn't exaggerate their position, and everything that they said was factually accurate in this point in time. And they got ahead of the prosecution's office. And so that means that they kind of get to set the tone. And they're challenging the prosecutors now to show us a cause of death. They're challenging the prosecutors to show us exactly how David murdered this person. And they're not saying that she wasn't murdered, because when you're an innocent party, why do you need to argue that? Because if you didn't do it, you didn't do it. And if someone was murdered, it's a travesty, but it wasn't me. So I like that they didn't say that she wasn't murdered, at least directly. They said that the cause of death wasn't established. And so they are already starting their theme for trial. When this case goes to trial, and I have no doubt that it will, that they're going to be arguing what they just said in that press release. When you go to these trial advocacy courses as attorneys, prosecutors, and defense attorneys, they always preach, start with your theme as early as possible. And there's no better time than to put out a press release before the DA office does so, especially when the DA office's press release is just so weak, that I think that the defense certainly has a leg up so far.
Do you think this is a case where, and again, we're just speculating here, is this perhaps an accident, a drug overdose, something that legitimately did happen that wasn't the fault of David or maybe anyone else? And then he or others just did the boneheaded move of, well, now we got to cover it all up and hide the body, and just it makes it look worse on them potentially. What do you think, just based on the evidence that we do have and what very little we know?
Well, the prosecution is going to have to prove that this wasn't an overdose and that this wasn't an accident. Now, obviously, again, there's a felony for disfigurement of a corpse. But in the grand scheme of things, that's not a big deal when you're dealing with first-degree murder. So what we need to know is what the pathologist, the coroner, found in the report. Did they get a second opinion? So they need a chemist to go in there, really, and test for every illegal drug substance known to man, and then determine whether or not it's to the type of levels that would cause an overdose. But the problem is that when a body starts to decompose, see, you have enzymes in your body that break down drugs. So, for example, if you get pulled over for driving under the influence of marijuana, it's not a crime to have marijuana in your system. It's a crime to be driving while impaired with marijuana in your system. And the way that they determine that is they test for certain metabolites. Metabolites are some types of proteins. I'm not a biologist, but they're proteins and enzymes that break up the THC components, and they're different stages. So you have stage 1 enzymes, and you have stage 2, and you have stage 3. And in order for the prosecutor to prove that a person with no alcohol in their system and only THC was under the influence of THC, it has to have the first stage of enzymes. Because if it has a stage 2 or stage 3, those are not enzymes that are typically there when there's any type of impairment. So if this body, her body, Celeste's body, was in the trunk for a prolonged period of time, and we know that it was likely there for a minimum of 11 days. You know, those enzymes could have already, like, even if she was an overdose, they could easily show that they're in the second and third stages. And even if, again, it was an overdose, they may not have the evidence to prove it because of when they found the body. It's an incredibly difficult case for the prosecution to prove. And it may be the reason why the LAPD is playing hot potato with the case. You know, the LAPD sheriff, the person in charge, is an elected official, just like the DA is. And they both want to appear like they are pro law enforcement, pro victim. And, you know, I saw this sometimes as prosecutors where a law enforcement agency would give me a case that they knew that I could never win in court, but they wanted me to decline it instead of them, because politically it didn't make them look bad if I declined the case, but it certainly looked politically bad if I did it. And, you know, I don't know if there's some chicanery going on here, politics, but the regular course of charging a celebrity with first degree murder shouldn't happen the way that it went down yesterday on Thursday evening.
Let's talk about David's behavior months ago. So, when Celeste was first declared missing, he didn't say a peep. You know, he has not really said a peep ever, pretty much, which generally is a good thing, especially when you then become a defendant, because as we discussed, you don't want to have those statements or words that can be used against you or twisted or looked for double meaning. But how do you think it looks for him that he didn't even say anything just when she was missing? Like, oh gosh, this is terribly sad. I hope they find her.
You know, we talk about this a lot in the media, and I'm thinking of the Bahamas case recently involving Brian Hooker. If you're not familiar with the facts, everybody, he was with his wife in the Bahamas on a small little dinghy boat, about 8 feet long, using an electric motor out in the ocean. And there were some strong waves, according to him, and she fell off the boat. And she was never seen again. He's been under investigation for murder for the last 10 to 11 days. And there's a lot of criticism about him not looking for his wife afterwards, and not doing this or not doing that. But I think that, you know, post-traumatic events are often overanalyzed to the point where, like, we start looking at shadows that aren't really even there. So for the Bahamas case, which is the, you know, Brian Hooker case, you know, you're in a foreign country. Now you're in target of first degree murder. And anybody in law enforcement knows that when you're searching for a body, especially when you're looking at current patterns in the ocean, like, you don't want interference from probably some drunk husband, and it appears like he was a drunk, getting in the way. And, you know, if I were the captain of the Coast Guard, I would tell him to sit this one out. We'll keep him advised about what's going on. So it doesn't bother me. And here, you know, if I'm his defense attorney, David Burke, I'm telling him the same thing that what his attorneys did tell him, which is don't say anything. Because no matter what you say, it's going to be misconstrued and it's going to be used against you one way or the other. It's a catch-22. But the one end of the catch-22 is worse than the other, which is actually making statements. And you often hear this as well, Claudia, like in the courtroom, and people will say that, you know, man, there was no emotion from the defendant when this person was testifying. Or there was no emotion from the defendant after the verdict was read. You know why there wasn't? Because that's what his attorney told him to do. I tell all my clients, I tell my victims when I was a prosecutor, Like, don't show emotions. Like, this isn't about you now. This is about the facts of the case. And you never know how somebody can interpret or misinterpret your emotions. We're all people, but let's say we're all watching the same football game and we have fans of one side and fans of the other side. And there's a controversial call at the end of the game that decides the game. You're going to have one side that vehemently and strongly believes that one thing happened correctly. And then you're going to have equally another set of people who think that the exact opposite happened. But they still watch the same game, but they have completely different ideas and beliefs about what happened. And it's the same thing about reading someone's body language, especially when they're in court. This isn't the first time that they're dealing with this information. They've been chewing on it for months, sometimes years. And when you've had that much time to think about something, you're not going to be reacting like you would if this was the first time you heard it. For example, let's say somebody dies. And unfortunately, somebody really close to me died yesterday. And it hit me really hard. It was like a punch in the face. I probably not going to be over it for quite some time. But I know, like, in a year or two, like, it's still going to be very sad for me, but it's not going to be like it is right now. And it's kind of like that for defendants. No matter whether they did it or not, it is still a traumatic event. They are being dragged through a torturous process. The process is part of the punishment, and it should be. It serves as deterrence, and it's also very meticulous and accurate. And I'll tell you, when you have thought about this tragedy for a very long period of time, and if somebody brought up the death of the person that died yesterday to me a year from now, I'm not going to react like I did yesterday, which was a lot of cursing and crying. And a year from now, I'm going to be fine. I'm still going to be sad. But when I am talking to regular people, it's just not going to have the same impact. And so that's what a defendant goes through whenever they're in the courtroom. They've already been around this. They've had to have meetings with their attorneys, experts. This is especially if they're in custody, because they have nothing else to think about. And so they reread. They probably have memorized every single letter, word, and sentence and paragraph in there, which sometimes makes them really annoying clients because they start going down these rabbit holes that don't mean anything. But we got to keep cognizant of that type of situation and not overread somebody's reactions or not reactions in a courtroom or after a murder happened, because you never know how you would react in that situation, especially if you're innocent. And you want to always listen to your attorney, and it appears that David has done that. So it appears to me, at least from that point of period on, been very intelligent. He knows enough to listen to his attorneys.
I love that you really explained that, because one of the things that is often very frustrating to me is the old, he didn't act right. And we see that a lot on Datelines or on Court TV or other shows where they're talking about a defendant and, after somebody's death or after an event, the police lean on, well, he didn't act right. Well, what is right? As to your point, is it screaming and wailing? Is it crouched in the corner crying? Is it cursing? We never know how we're going to react. And so it's very unfair to take a behavior and say, well, that wasn't how I would do it, so it's obviously not the right way. And I do still sometimes judge people, but I think it's interesting that police often lean on that so heavily because there's nothing scientific about it. There's nothing evidentiary really about it. Let's talk about the next couple days real quick. So David is in jail right now. Charged, not charged, official, not official. I don't know, because California does it really weird. But what's going to happen over the next couple days and through Monday procedurally?
So I predict that Monday, the Los Angeles District Attorney's Office will officially file a criminal complaint against David Burke. And what that means is they will set a preliminary hearing in about 10 days after that. And that and there's other ways that they can continue that, but it probably gives them about 2 weeks, because they don't count weekends and holidays, to really finalize this with a grand jury. I mean, that's what they want to do. They don't want to have a preliminary hearing. Again, as we discussed earlier in the show, it just gives the defense way too much ammunition to strengthen their case and simultaneously weaken the prosecutor's case. Then there's always the chance that a judge agrees with the defense and says there's no probable cause. But we all know the old saying that a grand jury will indict a ham sandwich. And I have a story about this. So when I was a prosecutor, I was prosecuting a serial burglar. He had burglarized over 100 different residential homes here in Arizona. He was a repetitive offender too. He had about 8 prior felony convictions, and to be listed in what's called the rope unit, it meant that you're always going to get the worst plea agreements. You're probably going to go to trial in every case. But we categorize you as a career criminal, that you're committing a felony every 24 hours. So it's really your job is to commit felonies. And I went to the grand jury and I presented evidence on 98 of the 100 homes that were burglarized. I just unintentionally lost track of 2 of them and didn't present any evidence about them. And the grand jury still indicted the defendant on the 2 charges that I didn't present any evidence on. I mean, of course, once I discovered this, I went back and I redid everything. And my case agent was pissed at me because he had to take off 3 days of work again. But it was a lesson to me how easy it really is to get a grand jury to rubber stamp anything. The only time that I've seen grand juries come back with what's called it's called a true bill, which means guilty in the grand jury, and a no bill is not guilty. The only time that I really see a no bill or a not guilty in front of a grand jury is when the prosecution kind of hints at the grand jury that that's the right thing to do. And that usually happens in police officer cases where they're presenting testimony about a police involved shooting, and the prosecution will actually put on experts to explain self-defense, which they would never do in any other type of case, arguing against themselves. Then you can see a no bill or not guilty happening. But primarily, it never happens. Grand juries, I love them, but they rubber stamp most things.
So we're predicting that this case is going to move forward. What is the biggest struggle for the prosecution going to be? So seemingly, if we don't get a cause of death, and we don't know, I mean, if her hyoid is broken or if there's a bullet hole through her skull, maybe we have additional things we could look at. But if we don't get a cause of death, and we're looking at what evidence we have right now, what is most difficult for the prosecution in successfully bringing this case? Okay,
so, and I would add a couple of things to that. So they don't have cause of death right now, and they don't have the toxicology as well. That is determining what was in her system or not in her system, because that can create arguments for both sides to argue about the significance of that. The prosecution, if they're going to win this case, has to have a pretty solid timeline of events. They have to be able to show that David Burke not only was there, but he had the opportunity to commit the murder. And I think also in a case where you do not have a cause of death, even though it's not required to find somebody guilty of any crime, you have to have motive. If you're going to win this case and you're going to sell this to a jury against some of the best defense attorneys in America, you better have a strong motive that's the undercurrent of your theory. Because if you're going in there with some half-assed theory about, well, she must have been murdered because she was in a trunk and she was dismembered, so of course she was murdered, I just don't think that that's going to work against these types of quality of defense attorneys. You have to have motive, and ideally, you need to have an eyewitness to something that happened that put David Burke at the scene of the crime. So motive, opportunity, and the ability to do this, or some type of admission, tacit admission, something that shows that he was aware that the murder was going to happen before it happened. The fact that he knew about it afterwards, that certainly helps, but it doesn't mean that he did it or that he ordered somebody else to do it. So in other words, we need a strong timeline. They need to be able to put him at the scene of the crime. And ideally, you want a motive and at least one statement that corroborates and puts everything together. That statement and the motive would be the glue for the case. If they have that, they certainly have a puncher's chance to get a guilty verdict.
Josh, you have prosecuted and defended really tough cases like this. And one of the things that you always point out, and it is 200% true, the presumption of innocence always stands. So what do you want people watching or listening to this to remember as this case moves forward?
The presumption of innocence, we hear that a lot. But what does that really mean? And I look towards the justice systems of other countries, and having actually worked in other countries, I began to realize how lucky we are in the United States. Because when you don't have the presumption of innocence, it gives the government way too much power. And when you have that much power, power always corrupts absolutely. And so we're lucky that we have that, because again, in most countries, the presumption of innocence is not there. There is a presumption of guilt, and you have to prove that you're not guilty. So the presumption of innocence makes sure that the government is following the rules, that they are applying the law equally and to everybody, despite whether or not you're a famous musician or you're just a homeless person off the street, that justice is blind. And without the presumption of innocence, we don't have the confidence that our legal system is going to be fair and impartial. And the basis for any functioning society is its legal system. If you look at any third world country and you're asking yourselves, why can't they be like the United States or Canada or wherever? Look at their legal system and see how fair it is. And the presumption of innocence really helps our system be fair, and it forces the government to follow the rules. Because it used to be that the British could just arrest anybody, hold them indefinitely without charging them, send them to prison without convicting them of anything. And you would be lucky to even have a trial where you could try to prove your innocence. So it was something that our founders realized had to change if we were going to have a successful society.
Any last thoughts on this case where it stands right now? I mean, I'm anxious to learn more about what evidence does exist. I'm anxious to see the timeline, as you mentioned, really interested in some digital records and some cell phone information. Any last thoughts from you looking forward?
If nothing else, I desire justice for Celeste. She was taken advantage of by somebody in a position of power. She did not have the mental capacity to consent to anything. So no matter what really did happen, she is a victim. And, I pray that she gets some justice. I also think that, these types of horrible crimes are one of the few things that really helps pull our society together. There are so many little differences that we have, but we do agree on about 90% of everything in life. The first, safety for ourselves and our families. We want to be able to live safely in our communities, and we appreciate good people, good neighbors. And of course, there's 10% that we disagree about, probably about politics. But, this is something that no matter what your politics are, it brings everybody together because we're all wanting the same thing, which is justice, and we want accountability, and we also want fairness in the system.
Very last question before we wrap this up for today, Josh. You mentioned earlier Celeste's family and that there's possibility that they were receiving money from David or they were aware of this relationship. Is there any potential of charges against them for anything that happened to Celeste?
Certainly, if the prosecution was able to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the family was aware and facilitated the delinquency of this minor, especially if they were aware of the sexual abuse, they could be charged under accomplice liability with felony charges of child abuse, with facilitation of sexual crimes. So it really depends on what the evidence is. But it's basically child sex trafficking. If they were aware that this adult or any person was paying you to have access to your daughter, knowing that the purpose was really to have a romantic sexual relationship, that is the definition of child sex trafficking, and they could go to prison for the rest of their lives if that's what they're able to prove.
Thank you. I just wanted to put that out there. So, Josh, you have been amazing today. I'm so glad that we got to talk through this case. I'm sure that we will be talking about it again here on No Contest because this is definitely not the end. So, for Josh Kolsrud, I'm Claudia King. This is No Contest, the Kolsrud, King, and Reed Report. Have a great day.